Welcome to the Westminster Standard Podcast. This is Ryan Beasy. At the General Assembly, there was an effort to modify witness eligibility to allow atheists to testify in the church courts. This effort failed, at least in part, due to the nature of oaths and the question of whether atheists can even be placed under oaths. Now there are new efforts to revise the rules of discipline for the Presbyterian Church in America in order to expand who may give testimony to the church courts. And so to help me understand these questions, I am joined by the Reverend Dr. James Bruce. Thank you for being on, sir. Welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, Dr. Bruce, this is your first time on the show. Hopefully not your last time. But why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us about your family, how you came to the Reformed faith and discerned a call to ministry. Kind of like one of those Presbyterian exams.
I'm a listener to the podcast, and I always find it interesting how you ask people how they came into the Reformed faith. And so many people do not say, I was raised Presbyterian. And I was not raised Presbyterian. I was raised by believing Baptist parents, but when I was an undergraduate, I started attending a Congregationalist church, which you would think would be the last place that you'd ever hear the gospel. But Norm Coop, the son of the late C. Everett Coop, the Surgeon
were you at
General,
Dartmouth at
my
the time?
pastor. Sorry?
Were you at Dartmouth at the time?
Yes. And so
Okay.
Norm was my pastor. In my freshman fall, he started preaching on Romans chapter 1. And he finished Paul's letter to the Romans my senior spring. So it's definitely reformed in my soteriology. But it was not until later that I became Presbyterian in my conviction. Of course, the sticking point was baptism. And my brother had a pastor. My brother entered the PCA before I did. And so it's definitely on my radar. But the question in 1 Peter 3 about how we can say that there's a baptism that saves us. And that's when I came to a sacramental understanding of baptism and the Lord's Supper, and that was really transformative for me.
Wonderful. My roommate in seminary went to Dartmouth and was discipled by the Reverend Coop. So then you had
now in glory, by the way.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes. So you have an undergraduate degree from Dartmouth and a Master of Philosophy from Oxford?
Theology.
Master of Theology, okay.
Yes.
From Oxford, and then where did you do your doctoral work?
Baylor. So I did
Baylor.
my PhD in philosophy in Baylor.
Great. Wonderful. And so you work at the university, and tell us about your work there.
So I'm a philosophy professor, and we joke about my three jobs. So I'm a philosophy professor and program head for the philosophy program at John Brown University. And then also at JBU, I'm the inaugural director of the Center for Faith and Flourishing. So people can go to faithandflourishing.org and click the donate button in the upper right-hand corner. And then finally, I am the part-time associate pastor at Covenant Church in Fayetteville, where I preach on average one Sunday a month, and I'm the director of Christian education. I'm also involved in presbytery. I'm on the administrative committee and candidates and credentials.
That's a lot to do. You're a busy man.
Yeah,
so
my
thank you for
wife
giving
and
us...
I celebrate our 20th wedding anniversary this November, and we have 4 children. 16 down to 6, daughter and 3 boys. So it's never a dull moment.
Indeed not. Well, let's dive into some of our discussion for today. We're talking about oaths, and so what is an oath?
I think an oath is a solemn calling upon God as a witness of what one says and judge of the truthfulness of what one says. So a solemn calling upon God as witness and judge.
Yeah, and that definition, very close to our Westminster standards, that it is not just, I really, really mean it, but it is calling on God to witness. And so that was part of the objection that you offered on the floor of General Assembly as to why we can't admit atheists. We can't just modify a few words to have atheists testify. We need to rethink the fundamentals of our judicial system.
Yeah, and I said on the floor of GA, if I remember correctly, that I've never, and this is not original to me, but I borrowed it for public use, that I've never heard anybody take an exception to chapter 22.
Yeah.
Ever. Have you? I've never have.
I have never encountered a presbytery grant an exception there. That's and yet that seems to be the crux of what we may be disagreeing over. So in one of your recent articles, you alleged that a godless oath is no oath at all, I believe.
Correct.
Would you unpack that? Here's just a snippet from the article you made. Your website is what? I'll put it in the show notes, but it's jamesbruce.com, right?
JamesEBruce.com.
JamesEBruce.com. Thank you.
Correct.
So would you unpack that, and we'll work through some of that your article as we go along if we have time.
Yeah. So basically, the broad brushstroke, I've got an argument there. I am a philosopher. But basically, broad brushstroke, it's a contradiction in terms to say that you're making a godless oath. It's a denying
a married bachelor. I think you used that illustration.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. Or to make it a negative, you could, the unmarried, like the married bachelor. But the other thing would be if somebody said, "Now I don't want to talk to any husband. I just want to talk to the unmarried husbands." If somebody said, "I want to talk to the unmarried husbands," we'd go, it's kind of like the plethora of pinatas. I do not think you know what the word husband means. So too, based on our standards' own conception of what an oath is, which is biblical, we can't say that something that is actually the specific difference of the thing, deny that and still call it the same thing. It would be like, I'm talking about dogs that aren't canines. Well, you just don't know what the words mean. So that's okay. the fundamental problem.
Yeah, so the issue is not that atheists are more likely to lie than theists.
Correct. Yeah. I just wanted to set that. I see why people are obsessed about that. And I mean, it is the ninth commandment, so we want to be sure that people in our courts are not bearing false witness.
Absolutely.
But for me, that doesn't motivate me, because I do think that there are people who would at least call themselves Christians. I think that this point was made on the floor. If we're concerned that somebody's going to lie about a teaching elder, for example, then why would we think that he or she would lie about believing in God in order to do it? So I think there's also that concern.
Yes, yeah, and it's an easy argument to make. The fool says in his heart there's no God. Are we going to admit fools to the church courts? And I don't think it's an invalid argument. I just don't think it's
Correct.
A good one. And I've made that argument myself. It's not clickbait, but it's that level of discourse. It shouldn't be the crux.
This may be speaking out of turn here, Beezy, but one of the things that I thought was interesting was that we had such a broad discussion on the floor of GA. There were people that said we should let atheists take an oath, which I think is just flatly contrary to the standards. But then on the flip side, we have people who saying we shouldn't let non-Christians take oaths. That, of course, is contrary to the BCO. And it's just to prepare you for the hate mail that you may receive for having me on. I do think that it's fair to say that BCO chapter 35, which is the kind of chapter under discussion, I think it's inelegant. I think it's worthy of revision. I think that work needs to be done. And so but I just thought that was interesting. There's such a broad perspective of views about a very narrow topic.
Yes, I've certainly heard the argument that only Trinitarians should be admitted before the church courts. It should not even, no Muslims, no Jews, no Jehovah's Witnesses. It should be the church courts are for the church, and the only people standing before them are Trinitarian Christians. And I haven't analyzed or thought about that a lot, but it is an argument that I think makes sense. But of course, no one has brought forth an overture to that In fact, although I do have a friend who threatened to do so. So maybe he will. And if that friend is listening, you're welcome to come on the podcast to discuss it if you want to ruin your reputation.
And one of the things that I think would be really fascinating, and this is where, is it Wayne Sparkman who does the BCO history stuff?
Yes.
What an invaluable
archivist
service to the church.
Oh, my.
And I wish that there was a corresponding Wayne Sparkman in the PCUSA, because the 1797, I was looking at it this morning trying to find the 1797 PCUSA, whatever their Book of Church Order was, because it's really fascinating. If you look at our chapters in the BCO, certain paragraphs, like the one about the husband and wife not having to testify against each other, that's in 1797. But paragraph 1 doesn't have a corresponding paragraph in 1797. And so I thought it would be fascinating to know whether or not our American Presbyterian forebearers were so shaped by the outlook of the American founding that they, of course, that they thought, well, yeah, of course a Unitarian can still testify in a Presbyterian court, or a Jew, because they believe in God.
In God.
And I just don't know the answer to that. This is where your Grove City College history degree will have to serve the church. I'm just a philosopher.
In your article, you do some good history on oaths, and you talk about pagan oaths, that
Sure.
Pagan treaties were verified by the gods as witnesses and judge. So this isn't an exclusively theist or Christian theist. This is human history. This is how humans have always understood an oath.
Correct. I was thinking about this in the chapter is in the confession, chapter 22, it's oaths and vows. And the only instance that I know and I'm open to correction here, but the only time I think of us taking oaths is prior to giving testimony in court. And so the kind of analog in my mind would be if somebody said, we want you to marry us, but we don't want to take the marriage vow. Or we want to become church members, but we don't want to take the membership vows. The philosopher in me wants to kind of try to get a mental grip on, what does that even mean? like what are you doing in marriage if not vowing?
Yeah. So what in your view is lost when we remove God, the explicit calling upon God as witness and judge? It's not just that atheists are more likely to lie, that's not what's being said. But what is lost in a church court when God is not called witness and judge, called as such?
Well, I think the first point, which I get from Larger Catechism 112 and 113, and also chapter 22. Chapter 22 talks about upon just occasion, that's when we give oaths. And the Larger Catechism 112 and 113 are on the third commandment.
Right.
And so I think the first thing for me is, well, what do we lose when we remove oaths from the church courts? The name of God. we lose the name of God. That's what we lose.
Which is a big deal.
It's a big
historically,
deal. Yeah.
Redemptive, historically speaking.
Yes.
The name of God is, by my own name, by my own. How many? It would be a fascinating
That's right.
Lord's Day afternoon exercise just to search on ESV. By my own name,
Correct.
Appears in the Scripture.
And I think, and this actually gives me, honestly, kind of, I say this with fear and trembling, that when a church court meets, it meets itself before the great judge of the living and the dead. That God alone is the Lord. He alone is the one who judges justly. And so I think that we lose that. And then also the kind of more technical thing is, if you take the Confession of Faith, chapter 22, and then you take Larger Catechism 112 and 113 together, I wonder whether the upon just occasion of the oaths is when, and we cannot neglect from using oaths or using the name of God when so required, whether or not, in fact, we're bound to use oaths in church courts. To put it in the other way, if we don't require oaths in the context of church courts, I don't know that we'll ever use them. I can't think of a single I'm open to correction here, but I can't think of an instance in the Book of Church Order. We have marriage vows, membership vows, we vow,
vows. Right?
But oaths. If we don't require an oath in the context of a church court, we may just give up on oaths entirely, which would be strange. It'd be strange to have a provision in the Westminster Confession of Faith that we don't change the way that we change stuff about the magistrates, that we just left there as a spandrel of history, like, oh, and there are these oaths, but then we would never use the oaths. So that seems inelegant to me. So obviously the most important thing is the name of God, but then there are other things that the philosopher in me goes, what does this mean? What are we doing here?
Mm-hmm. It struck me as I was thinking on this issue in preparation for today that everyone in the Presbyterian Church in America, everyone, in order to gain standing before a church court, must take oaths and vows, and particularly vows, to be a church member. Right? No one has standing before a church court without that vow. A member can come and can bring a complaint to a church court, the session particularly, only because he's taken vows. Officers, as we come to presbytery, we take vows. And that is one of the ways, without which not. If you haven't taken this vow, you have no standing before the church court. Even interns, licentiates, are administered not just solemn promises, but vows of a sort. And so now
also, Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, it seems like we're trying to change trying to open, maybe to crack the tent just enough to let a camel's nose in, to mix a metaphor.
What strikes me about the possible change here is how chapter 22 understands oaths as part of religious worship. And I have, until I think this year, well, no, that's not true. That's not true. I was about to say something that's false. I was about to say I haven't really thought about this until this year, but I'll explain why it's important. So the oaths are taken as part of religious worship. The reason why I was not incensed, but my preparatory philosopher's guide to the overtures, the reason why I wrote my initial diatribe, my little essay on oaths in the spring in preparation for June, was because I've actually done a lot of reading on this issue. So very quickly, if you say, kids, you can't pray in school, then what would be the rationale for that? The rationale for that would be, well, because we have a strict separation of church and state. And so we have a strict separation of church and state because we have what? A godless constitution. And so the provision in the Constitution for taking an oath of office, there is controversy. And Mark David Hall, who's written a number of books on Christianity and the American founding, has really made this point, and I'm persuaded by it, that people in the 18th century understood an oath as a religious act. So when there's no religious test for office, that was, are you a Quaker? Are you a Presbyterian? Are you a Baptist? Are you Episcopalian? But there was a religious test insofar as you had to take an oath of office. And so that's for me. And so then if the Constitution is not godless, then we have to understand the separation of church and state in a different way. And so it actually can shape Supreme Court rulings on church-state issues. So there's a lively constitutional debate that's live today based on interpretation of oaths in the time of the American founding, going back to the 1700s, but also part of the common law tradition. So that's why I'm alive to it. That this is something that's I wouldn't say it's a hot topic, but it certainly compared to some of the philosophical topics that I'm obsessed with, it's a hot topic.
Well, and even, and especially in the church court, that was the debate of the 50th General Assembly. There really wasn't much debate on. There was some RPR got a little bit of debate, but the time expired, I think, and had to be extended, didn't it? Or maybe somebody. I think we don't know. Our former moderator tried to call the question, so maybe not the time.
Yeah,
but
this. Can I just say one more thing? This reminds me of the fact that that I think that we, as the PCA, should always think of oaths as a religious act. This is part of religious worship. So I think that's how we should just always think of it.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So why not then do away with oaths as part of our rules of discipline, and just have a promise? Someone might say, well, the urgency, the scandal of abuse warrants this accommodation. Is there an argument to be made that no, oaths, vows, the solemnity of church courts go together, that you can't have a church court without oaths and vows? Or is there some middle way that we could find?
Well, so there are a couple of different questions here. So one thing about removing oaths altogether is that it would actually rob Christians of the opportunity to perform a religious act of worship, of calling God as witness and judge of what they say. So one reason not to remove oaths would be that you'd be denying people the opportunity to perform a religious duty. I mean, this is not quite the parallel, but we would never permit someone, a minister, to publicly preside at the Lord's table and take the Lord's table himself, but in front of the people and not include the people. Why? Well, because this is the Lord's table and we're calling people to worship together. So too, this is the church of the court of the Lord Jesus Christ. He is the king and head of the church. He is the judge of all the living and the dead. And so now, but we want you to come and speak before the church, but we're going to deny you the opportunity to perform a religious act of worship. So I think that would be a bad idea. The question of the urgency or the scandal of abuse, I mercifully do not know about scandalous urgent abuse and the PCA warranting such accommodation. That's not to say it doesn't exist. I say this with, gentleness. I just don't know about it, and so I don't know how to measure as to enter into my calculus of judgment when I have it's a kind of data-free environment for me. It would be really helpful if people who don't like what I'm saying to tweet at me or email me saying, look, what about this SJC case? Or here's an instance where, somebody who was arrested and convicted of horrible crimes was nevertheless not excommunicated. I mean, if that stuff exists, I would love to hear about it, because then it would make the urgency and scandalous nature more than a hypothetical, which to me it is. That's not to say that there's.
That's what was brought up a number of times this past year, that there's no instance in the history of the PCA, and then going back to our predecessor communion in the PCUS, there's no instance of someone being denied the right to testify on the basis of atheism. And so it seems like this is a solution in search of a problem, which
the one kind of remember, I'm a philosopher, so I always like to think of the other side.
Yeah.
And I've heard you do that on this podcast, so I feel tremendous license to do this. But one thing the other side could do...
I'm just impressed that you listen to the podcast.
I like it. You're doing good work.
Thank you.
I mean, this will be like a low point in the history of the podcast, but you'll bottom out with me, and then it'll be onward and upward from here on out, BZ. But in... Paragraph 3 of chapter 35 talks about how it must be upon two witnesses, and then it says, well, you could have one witness with corroborating evidence. And so I think that somebody who wanted to advocate for a change in this direction could do a couple different moves. Number one, some people said at GA, at least I remember one person in particular saying, well, what if it's the only person who says she was raped? And this is, potentially terrifying because it would be one accuser. And so I think a better thing would be to say, well, BCO 35.3 actually says that this kind of sole instance hypothetical would never count by itself. It would need corroborating evidence. So then I wonder whether or not, instead of doing something where we get rid of oaths altogether, if we could actually have maybe witnesses who give testimony under oath, and then maybe spectators who offer evidence, or spectators who make statements. Spectators make statements, but then a court can say, well, this is not a witness giving testimony, but it counts as corroborative evidence.
Well, and what could happen is, if this person believes, that this church member raped her, she can go to the civil magistrate and appeal for relief there. And if the statute of limitations has passed, she can still sue him for civil damages. And then in that, there will be a deposition, which would be admissible because it's not testimony. It's just material. It's evidence. So you can admit, the church court could admit depositional evidence from the civil court. So it's not...
Sorry, go ahead. I interrupted you.
Well, so it's not that she would be excluded or he would be excluded simply on entirely. There's material evidence, a rape kit, a doctor, a police report, which was stated at General Assembly. All of that is admissible.
Yeah, it's interesting too that I talked to a ruling elder who is a medical doctor and who deals with all sorts of stuff. And one of the things that he said to me that I thought was fascinating but also troubling was he pointed out that if a session of a local church actually contacts the local atheist OB-GYN to get information about what the rape kit says, she will think, and I say this dispassionately, she will think, this medical doctor told me, that one of the men is the rapist. So you actually, why would a bunch of men at this church want to know prior to trial what the rape kit says? So I think that these kind of arguments actually hurt people who want to make a change to BCO 35. It's fantastical, but then also if you think about it, it seems unseemly. You wouldn't want to kind of put your nose into the civil magistrate's affairs.
Right.
So
right.
That's where, but I also think it could harm reputation. I think that A better argument would be, which I've read in this overture that's coming out, or that was passed by a presbytery, that, emphasizing the fact that there could be corroborative evidence that is actually beneficial and helpful, right? So somebody says that, Ryan Beasy was screaming profanities at a member of his congregation, and it's just one person, but your atheist neighbor heard you, say, good afternoon, Mr. Baggins, how are you doing? Or something, that's the kind of stuff where I think that, and obviously it can go both ways, but that's where, maybe having a spectator who makes statements could be a way to introduce the evidence. Now, the problem is, and I've asked people who are far more knowledgeable than I am, because there was a speaker at GA who talked about all of the ways that a case could gather evidence. And I don't know about you, but I don't know all of those ways. And so one way of thinking about, okay, how can we improve BCO 35 is trying to articulate not an exhaustive list of ways that a court could gather information, but at least give us some broad brushstroke. Here's what an investigation looks like. Here's what because I think that if you've been on the SJC for 5, 10, 15, 355 years, then you have all of this at your fingertips. But at least for me, I just don't know. And so that I think could be helpful too.
Yeah, and that's one of the big mistakes that church courts make, is that they try to handle things without talking to someone who knows what's going on, knows the process. They try to handle it at session level, and they botch it, and then someone walks. Well, that's not an issue of an atheist being barred. It's an issue of the lower court didn't get advice. They pretended like they were Congregationalists when they're actually Presbyterians, and you can call people.
Correct.
I've called our current moderator. Hey, I've got this issue. What do I do? And I've called the editor of the Aquila Report. Hey, we've got this issue. What are the steps that we should follow? And they're happy to help. And I have yet to get a bill. People,
Correct.
Elders in the PCA are so generous with their time, including present company. So people are happy to help. It's just a matter of acknowledging, I do not understand what this means. How do I follow this process? So you brought up an overture that came out of or is coming out of Piedmont Triad Presbytery. Let me put that on the screen just a minute here. I gave our highly paid production team the week off. So. So here it is, but it amends BCO 35 paragraphs 1 and 8. So it simply says, any person who promises to testify truthfully can be called as a witness. Either party has the right to object to a witness, and the court shall consider and rule on the objection. And so it strikes the language that requires proper age, intelligence, and specifically excludes those who do not believe in the existence of God or a future state of rewards and punishments. So the new eligibility, if this amendment is adopted, would be any person who promises to testify truthfully. So that's why I ask, what do we lose if we just promise as opposed to swear an oath? And then it gives the promise, right? It strikes reference to oath or affirmation, but the court shall inform the witness that regardless of whether he believes in God or a future state of rewards and punishments, his promise is made in the presence of God and will judge him on the truthfulness of his answers. The moderator shall then ask the witness the following: do you solemnly promise, and then they strike out in the presence of God, that you will declare the whole truth, the truth, and nothing but the truth, according to the best of your knowledge, and in the manner in which you are called to witness? And so then they strike a reference to answer to the great judge of the living and dead, to whom you've referred a number of times, just in the last few minutes. So at first blush, this seems maybe a middle way, a compromise, or with the lack of an oath and simply a promise. Do you see this as still fundamentally flawed?
Well, first of all, let me say that I'm grateful for the willingness of these men to help us think about the issue. And I like much of what they've written. I think some of the rationale, though not always supportive of the overture, is just true and
Yes.
worthy of reflection. And as I said before, I don't like the way BCO 35 reads myself. So I think we should change it. And also this overture is less objectionable to me than what we considered in June. So it takes the idea of having an atheist making an unlawful oath and counting as an unlawful oath. It takes that off the table, and I'm very grateful for that.
That's definitely an advance in the conversation.
Correct. I do think, though, that by getting rid of, I think it gets rid of oaths altogether.
Yes.
And so then what's interesting is I appreciate the fact that they say, well, even if you don't believe in God, we're going to, we do, and God is going to be a witness and judge of what you say. But you deny the opportunity of someone to partake in the religious act of taking an oath. So that's the first thing. I think the second is I still worry about a third commandment violation. Where else would we take an oath but in the context of a church court? And so that to me is troubling. I also think, before I try to make a positive, possibility, is the current BCO language is all persons of proper age and intelligence are competent witnesses, except those who don't believe in a God who judges the living and the dead. But that means that a girl who's not mentally impaired, who believes in God as witness and judge, can testify. BZ, that is an excellent protection for her. If we allow church courts to have more discretionary judgment over the degree to which someone counts as a witness in order to accommodate atheists, then the accused party, especially the wicked, will make sure that there are all sorts of objections to the little girl testifying. So it could actually make things worse and not better. We could allow witnesses to testify, possibly with some objections. But then there'd be a whole host of other people that, instead of the language being all persons of proper age and intelligence are competent witnesses, we get the language of, well, they can be called as a witness. And notice that instead of saying you can challenge a witness who's, there's a question about incompetence. I mean, I think that's in the technical sense of, and no, not trying to be glib, but this person is mentally incapable of serving as a witness.
That seems to be the only ground under the current language. Is that what you're saying? The only ground to challenge a witness is mental competence and age, whereas this would open the door to all manner of challenges,
objections. Yeah, exactly. So you could challenge, you could object to a witness. You could say, well, and I hate this. I find this an abomination. But just to think of how people would use it. Doesn't she wear scantily? Isn't she scantily clad? Doesn't she have some, and this is speaking of a believer, a member in good standing of the church. That would be an objection that you could make if the change goes through. But it's not an objection that I think you could make with the current language. So it could make things worse, not better.
And we'll play a clip from a podcast that's already discussed this issue, and one of the items they bring up is this came out so quickly, and perhaps they're just jumping the gun here more time and reflection were needed in order to come up with better language that doesn't open this door to a flurry of objections to a witness, which seems to be a more narrow gap here.
Yeah, I kind of the philosopher in me really likes what they did, because I think that if you get something out first, then the Beesies and Bruces squabble over it, and then September, October, November, December, January, February, people are going back and forth, and so you've got 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 overtures coming up to next year's GA. People really
they get the conversation going.
Yeah, get the conversation moving.
Maybe Hills and Plains will send some really good language up that we can that'll bring us together. Even more.
I know the PCA counts on us too much. The pressure is just if Mississippi Valley could only put an oar in the water, things would be better.
Yes. Well, so you brought up a good point. One of the good points you brought up earlier was how this deprives the Christian of the opportunity to take an oath before a church court. I want to play a short clip from the Reformed Churchman podcast as they're discussing this, because in the rationale, one of the things that the authors of this overture assert, that they seem to go back and forth, or at least as these two members of PTP Presbytery. So let me get your reaction to this.
I guess we can read those points. Summary of what the proposed amendment does and does not do. The amendment expands witness eligibility and permits church courts to hear the testimony of persons who are willing to affirm the revised questions. The amendment retains a party's right to object to the admittance of any witness. The amendment requires the court to inform every witness, regardless of individual beliefs, of his oath or affirmation is made in the presence of God, and that God will judge him on the truthfulness of his answers. The amendment modifies the exemplary promise such that it is more generally applicable to Christians, non-Christian theists, and atheists. The amendment does not require the court to permit any person to testify as a witness. Only witnesses who affirm that they will testify truthfully are permitted to be considered as witnesses. If either party objects to the admittance of a witness, the court shall consider and rule on the objection. The amendment does not require the court to attach the same degree of credibility to the testimony of every witness. The amendment does not require the court to administer an oath to any witness for whom an oath to God would be unlawful. So it is interesting, Kevin, that they in their rationale are still saying this could be an oath for a believer. So it's almost like whatever you believe it to be, you're doing, that's what you're doing. And I'm just not a fan of postmodern sort of, it is whatever you want it to be kind of thing.
The number 4 that you read, I would take a little issue with. It says the amendment modifies the exemplary promise. And my point, and really the crux of my whole argument, is it doesn't modify the exemplary promise. It substitutes a promise for an oath. And
yes, that's
like I said, there are many other arguments to be had, but to me, that's the first and foremost one that we should be having. And you're right. It doesn't require, it actually disallows any oaths. If the language strictly taken does not even allow an oath.
And that's an important distinction. And honestly, I've actually heard the authors of this make that argument. The only thing that matters is what's in the BCO, not the rationale, for them to make that argument in other areas. And that's right. And so now there's no oath in there.
So it seems like there's some confusion maybe from even the authors of this overture that they say oath or number 4, oath or promise. What is that? Is that kind of wanting it both ways?
Yeah, I'm not sure. It is true that your rationale is not what is adopted. I wonder whether the let me see. How can I be? I'm going to be how can I be maximally charitable? BCO 35, the language is itself unclear. So I want it to be clearer. The oath or affirmation language is actually, and again, you get this in, early American founding constitutional interpretation. So taking an oath is, I swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help me God. But Quakers were unwilling to say the word swear. And so instead, we said, okay, you can affirm. I affirm, to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And that was basically counted as an oath because you weren't saying the word swear, but you were solemnly promising to tell the truth before God as your witness and judge. That's clean. the language of the BCO is confusing because oath or affirmation is used, and then there's a line in there where it's something like or other words if you feel uncomfortable with them. I forget exactly what it is, but the challenge there is that I think in the older sense, so 18th century, 19th century, the other words part was, I don't want to say I swear to tell the truth. Okay, I affirm, I promise, but then the content of the oath was the same. It was just your little prolegomenon of I swear, I affirm, I attest, I solemnly promise. The way that it reads in the BCO, and I hate saying this, but I think it's true, and I think it should be said, the way that it's said in the BCO is so confusing that it almost does read as though you could say, I swear by Allah to, by Allah the most merciful, or hey, I'm an atheist and I can't use this language. If there wasn't paragraph 1 of BCO 35, then I think that we would have had atheists swearing already and being witnesses in church courts because of the ambiguity in paragraph 8, where it's just where if you want other language, I think it's if you want other language insofar as you don't want to say the word swear like Quaker, I affirm or I solemnly promise, but the content of the speech is the same, and so it's an oath. It's a lawful oath. It's just being kind and patient with people's sensitive consciences. But the way it's written, it is almost like, I want to use other language.
Yeah, you can bring your own oath. Currently, the oath or affirmation to a witness shall be administered by the moderator in the following or like terms. So that's very subjective. So in a way, they're doing us a service here by providing this is what you shall say. But is this what we want as a church to have as our exemplary promise?
Correct. And I think the answer is no. But I do think that they have done us a service. Back to the podcast comments, the number 5, the amendment does not require the court to permit any person to testify as a witness. This I actually see as a weakness of this overture and not a strength because of the rationale that I gave previously.
Yeah.
I think that giving the court a kind of, we just judged that she just didn't really fit as a witness. No, you need to say that she's incompetent, right?
And our Standing Judicial Commission will give great discretion over witness competency to the lower court. So what this change would do would broaden their discretion by orders of magnitude beyond what my non-mathematical mind can explain.
And if you think about the people that we would be most concerned about being an abuser, would be a person at a big steeple church who had the sway of the entire presbytery, was marvelously popular, very polished. He would have sway over his session, sway over his presbytery. And so I think that's where we would want to guard against him being able to say, or his acolytes being able to make the case that we just shouldn't, Sally, she doesn't really fit with how things are, as opposed to, are you saying, and I say this I do not say this glibly, are you saying that she is mentally retarded?
Mentally incompetent,
mentally unable to. Are you saying that?
Which is an objective standard. It makes it very subjective, which fits with our postmodern age. That this is, and they alluded, Sayer and Miller alluded to that earlier. That there seems to be some postmodernism that they detected. Now I wasn't there for the debate, but it seemed like they're concerned about how postmodernism has influenced the rationale and therefore the overture as itself. But,
Well, this goes back to this may be too much. You can edit this out if you want to, but whenever I've thought of chapter 22 of the Westminster Confession of Faith, it's never been in these kinds of debates, and so I'm grateful for further edification in our standards, thinking and reflecting on things. For me, and again, I'm not a historian, but for me, I think of chapter 22 in the context of the 1640s of being concerned about the Jesuits. And so 22 paragraph 4 talks about the oath has to be in the plain and common sense of the words. There can be no equivocation or mental reservation. And so for me, it's always been, don't say what A, meaning not A, but somehow having some story of how it doesn't really matter either way.
Yeah.
And so I would say that this has always been a problem for the church. There's a line in Turretin in his Institutes of Elliptic Theology where he says something like, and I'm not saying are these brothers are heretics by any stretch of the imagination, but he talks about, I think he's talking about the Socinians, and he says something like, they love smoke, by which I think he means they love it when things are kind of murky. And so you're not really pinned down on language. And we don't want to be pinned down on language because, we like to get along with people. We have to cross the pain threshold of saying, hey, you said that, and I think that's wrong. Also, it's hard to do mental work. I'm not a Humean in my philosophy, but David Hume, I think, and Descartes in his Meditations, he has a nice line where he says he's trying to doubt everything, but it's like, man, this is really hard. And then I just go and enjoy life. And I think Hume has a similar line where it's like, yeah, you can think philosophically for a while, and then you're like, I want a donut. I just want to, I want to live life. But this is where I think, I commend the men at having us think through these issues. Yeah. And I think in terms of, I mentioned that, the positive idea, I don't know if anybody will take me up on this, is, could we have spectators who make statements that constitute some kind of evidence that then there's a discretionary judgment? Whereas if anybody is willing, meet some minimum standard of mental capacity, who's willing to take an oath before God as witness and judge, then he or she, can be called as a witness. Whereas then there can be, you could kind of localize, maybe have atheists make statements that are not under oath, and then also localize the squabbling over, well, does that person really count? Because then that would give, maybe an opportunity for people to make statements that contribute to the evidence that the court considers, but at the same time, not allowing the court to exert discretionary judgment against someone that, as the BCO language currently stands, would have full standing before the court. You're a 13-year-old girl, but you're a member of the church. We want to hear what you have to say.
For the record, he's not talking about me. But yeah,
you're like 18 or something.
Currently it is simply mental competency, which is an objective standard. A medical, psychological, people with a lot of degrees and framed pictures on the wall can prove that this person does have the mental competence, whereas now it's quite left open. There's something else in their rationale that I wanted to discuss with you, and kind of circles back to an earlier comment. They make the argument in the rationale that previously we lived in a theistic society, and that's not the case anymore. And so we need to reflect that in our church courts, that there are a lot more atheists in this post-Christendom era. And so it's highly likely that they will have to testify, which kind of addresses the statement that this has never been an issue, that this is a solution in search of a problem. And I suppose, perhaps, what they're saying is, well, that might have been the case for the first 50 years of the PCA, but that wasn't in a post-Christian, post-theistic culture. Now, what you bring out in your article is this is just how humans have always understood oath, that it's always calling the gods or God, the divine, to witness. Do you think this is a fair consideration, that since we are no longer in a theistic society, that we need some mechanism, those spectators who bring testimony?
Well, it's interesting. Here I'm going to be contrarian. Surprise, surprise. And it's when you look at the Pew research, and they're out of, isn't the Pew money somehow connected to your alma mater, Grove City?
It is connected to Grove City. Yes, J. Howard Pew and
Yep.
Was one of the early supporters, and his son, big supporters of
So,
I think.
Yeah, so one of the things that's interesting about Pew with they have really great data on the nuns, and not the order of the Catholic Church, but the Roman Catholic Church, but the NONES. And what I find fascinating is if you drill down on people who say, "What's your religion?" None. Do you pray? Well, of course. Right? Do you believe there's a God? Yes. And so people talk about, and so there are atheists who are committed to the belief that there is no God. But I'm a philosopher, so I run into these. But I'd say they're few and far between of people who are actually committed to the non-existence of God. I think that we could have agnostics, we could have people who believe in God. So I'm count me skeptical about the rise of secularism. Of course, people could say, "Oh, you live in Arkansas," and I do, but
you've not always lived in Arkansas. You've lived.
No, I've not always lived in Arkansas.
In Oxford,
I like it here.
Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
But you've lived.
Yeah, I was born in Cambridge,
world.
Massachusetts, which last I heard still has a communist bookstore. So I understand the type, but I think we need to be careful about what we claim for the general culture.
Yeah, I think atheists are a peculiarity of the university. There really aren't, outside of the ivory tower. I don't really encounter a lot of atheists, someone who genuinely believes that the universe is, was, and all there ever will be. So I'm not sure how well they are assessing the culture. That's a great point that you make. As someone who's lived,
the one thing I think is true about the culture is the rise of social media, the proliferation of podcasts, from blogging to Twitter and Instagram and TikTok today. I think it's much more likely that something that would have been a private matter in the year the PCA was founded will now be a public matter, at least a local public matter. And so that's where I think they could make the argument that, like you put out the podcast, there could be people in Jamaica or Kenya or Bangladesh writing you angry emails, never have Bruce on again or whatever, right? So the kind of global connectivity does mean that there will be lots more people outside the church that could be interested in what's going on in the church and could know about what's going on in the church instantaneously. I mean, I assume people do it. And I know people do it with us. Like, we'll have people visit the church and they will talk specifically about things that I've written. It's kind of, it's kind of strange, but it is, you know, it's and even fellow ministers. I remember I was in a committee meeting for presbytery, and somebody rather snarkily quoted negatively somebody that we had speak at the church, whom you know, and all I said was, well, thank you for listening. You know, we put it online. But so that's where I think they have a case to make that if you're a professor and a pastor in Northwest Arkansas, then you can create controversy internationally because of the internet in a way where this would be more localized. So maybe instead of saying the culture has become more secularized and so we need to draw atheists in, maybe the argument they could make is church life is exposed to the world in a way that it wasn't before. So it's more public in nature, and so needs a public response, or I don't know.
Yeah, and it was asserted a number of times at General Assembly that, you know, the world is watching. What will the headlines be? And, you know, that was a poor argument, but it also, to some extent, that does factor in because we're supposed to be a city on a hill. We're supposed to be a light to the nations. And if we are just a bunch of, you know, Neanderthals in smoke-filled rooms, exonerating one another, well, that's contrary to our calling as a city on a hill, to make the name of Christ famous. Something else in their rationale I wanted to pose to you before, as we kind of bring this baby in for a landing. Outright lies, they say, not only threaten the justice of the church courts, constitutional obstacles to the open pursuit of truth, wherever it may be found, are perhaps a more sinister, because a more subtle way that falsehood may prevail and injustice multiply to the harm of the most vulnerable under our care. And so in the perspective of the authors of this overture, this is a constitutional obstacle that atheists cannot bring testimony to the church courts. Well, do you see this as a constitutional obstacle, or is the requirement of an oath a biblical and theological principle that's at the heart of our doctrine?
So this is an example of, I said earlier that this overture has beautiful rationales that are often quite true, but may not be supportive of this particular overture. So I think it is a truth that constitutional obstacles to the open pursuit of truth, wherever they're found, can in fact be more sinister because more subtle.
Oh, yeah.
You know, so I think that, so thinking about the structure of things is really important. But that's why I go back to the proposed change for 35.1, where we could actually end up narrowing the pool of potential witnesses by having people raise all sorts of objections that are independent from a person's ability to a person's mental capacity. So then the second question of is the requirement of an oath for a witness in a church court, is that central? Like, did you say, is that central?
Is
to
that
our
merely
religion?
a constitutional process, or is that something central to being a church court and our religion?
I don't know. I mean, the comments that I gave to the authors of the overture, who kindly asked me to provide comments, was here I find it unsettling, but I can't. I've tried to, with you, articulate some of the reasons why, but it's kind of like if somebody wanted to join the church without taking vows of church membership. How would I respond? What would I say?
Yeah.
It would be really confusing to me what the person thought we were doing here. But then in terms of providing a rationale, I think for me, I go back to the third commandment. So I think the argument they would have to make is we honor the name of God by, and having him present in the court by declaring publicly that God is the witness and judge of everything that's said here, kind of a prolegomena to the proceedings of the court. So, Jay, look, we're not third commandment violation, but then they'd have to make some argument of dissociating taking an oath from being a witness. And here I think that, I remember somebody saying on the floor of GA something like, why are we going to kowtow to what old men said or something like that? And I took that person to be referencing our standards, which I thought horrifying, but maybe upon further reflection, it was actually saying, well, Bruce and Beezy, who cares if all the way, for thousands of years, people have been taking oaths before God as witness and judge, and in order to give testimony, testimonial evidence to court, we're not beholden to that. But I'd want to be motivated to believe that, and I'd want it to be something greater than the occasion of our age demands it. But then similarly, I need to think more about why I believe the way that I do. And I want to try to, we all want to try to think biblically, but I'm thinking of certain instances in the Old Testament where, somebody would say, like, give glory to God. And that is an exhortation from someone to someone else.
With Achan in exactly. Joshua 7, I think.
And so I wonder whether they could say that they're trying to do something like that, where the exhortation of the court is sufficient. But for me, then I kind of step back and I think, well, who should be giving testimony in a church court anyway? And I was trying to think about if we were the Westminster divines and, it's the 1640s, would we, and we had Presbyterian leanings, would we actually think that anybody, I think that it would be an abomination to imagine that a Jesuit or a papist could speak in a church court. I think that would just be shockingly horrible. Okay, That's the divines. Now, in the American context, you've got the Quakers, you've got in the American experiment, it makes sense that in 1797 they rewrite the magistrate stuff. Earlier, now they've got their whatever book of order they call it. And maybe they do think, hey, the Quakers and, and that's where I'm trying to be as candid and as open as possible here.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're coming up on just a little bit, almost an hour and a quarter. So as we bring it in, I think one of the things you've contributed to this discussion is the need to consider the third commandment. A lot of this discussion has revolved around the ninth commandment, which is important. But if we're dealing with oaths, that falls under the third commandment. And I highly commend you for your article. Thanks for contributing that. I think it's the most recent post on your blog, jamesebruce.com. People can check that out.
I would write more if I had fewer jobs.
Well, that can be arranged. What are some of, as we bring it in for a close, what are some of the hopes, aspirations, concerns, encouragements that you find in the PCA?
Well, I love the PCA. I love the long-term deliberation over contentious issues that we have. I know that people get very upset about it, but I actually think it's marvelously fruitful. In fact, I think that the General Assembly and the ad interim committee reports actually do the work of what people would think that a seminary or a college would do, but doesn't. And so I think that even if I was outside the PCA, if I had a question about how to, how do you think about human sexuality biblically, or how should the church respond to domestic assault and sexual abuse, then I think that the PCA is producing resources that are exemplary. I mean, they are just sublime, really, really good stuff. So I think that's marvelously helpful. I also think that, in terms of the divides that we have, I think that sometimes, I find that if I get to know people who have different positions, that it's a wonderful thing for me to be reminded of how we really are like-minded, really are in the same denomination. I went and visited some friends, and I encouraged them not to attend their church, but to go with me to a PCA church of somebody that I think on kind of some of our ideological battles would be on the other side. I found it marvelously encouraging. I would love for my friend to go to that church and just be fed the riches of the gospel. I think in recent years, I've been really encouraged by ruling elder involvement. I've seen this at GA. I've also seen this at the presbytery level. I have the privilege of being basically the person who tries to gather all the nominations for the administrative committee for our presbytery. And it's been really exciting to see. And I think some of the resources that you're involved with generating and others, where people who have, they're surgeons or they're accountants or, they're teachers, plumbers, whatever, they're learning, and they are learning about the scriptures and about our standards. And they're also seeing the value of being involved in church courts. And then I think finally what's really encouraging is how, and there's a downside of social media, there's a downside of the interconnectivity, but I think a great upside is the clarity. And so when you were talking to George Sayer and others on, I think it was your last podcast, was it your last podcast where they had the chapel discussion?
Yes.
Yeah. And I thought that was really fruitful, because one of the things that what I heard in that discussion was, we just need to think about what a chapel service is. Because for me at JBU, I don't think of chapel as church.
Right.
And so I would almost be, I hate to put it this way, but I would almost be a secularizing influence. Like, I'd love for us to sprinkle in some chapel speakers who are pretty, like, they're politicians or they're academics, because for my center, it'd be great to bring somebody and say, hey, come speak before 800, 900 students. So
and that's the way we did chapel at Grove City. So
is that right?
So these concerns about preaching, like, well, it's chapel. What's the problem, guys?
Yeah, no, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, for me, it's until these guys brought it to mind. Well, it is a church function because it's owned and operated by the PCA, whereas Grove City, was owned by the PCUSA, but not really, and now it's completely independent. So, my experience with chapel was, we would have Dr. Julie Moeller,
the clown hour.
Well,
or something?
Yes, but we would have Orthodox, like Dr. Julie Moeller on the religion department. She would come speak in chapel, and I had no problem with that because it was just chapel.
Yeah.
It wasn't in the church.
Lecture,
I saw it as a lecture. Yeah, she gave a great, I still remember it, speech lecture on David's, his final psalm.
Yeah,
and where he reflects on his life and his righteousness, and she taught the gospel, and it was teaching. So I didn't have a problem with that in the context of Grove City, but that was a paradigm shifting conversation that I had, with Job and with George.
Well, but this is where I think it's so helpful to have the clarity. I also think that when there is some kind of controversy, you're not hearing wars and rumors of wars. Instead, you're Googling, you pull up the YouTube video where, Beasy actually said that. And so then there isn't a kind of like, well, you weren't really there, you don't know what happened. Instead, it's, no, I mean, how do you explain what you said and give an account for yourself? And I mean, I think that this was, and you did this again. I mean, it's like I should get some kind of revenue stream for all the promotional, speech.
The check is in the mail.
Yeah, but I think that you being able to pull out audio from a podcast or here is what this particular woman says before she preaches in this context, and I think that that's enormously helpful for the church, and I think that some of the realignment of people is enormously helpful. If there are people who go, well, I don't know, they sorry to use these words, but if we say conservative and progressive, maybe they find themselves too conservative for the PCA. The PCA is insufficiently pure. Well, they can go. Then they're progressives who, they choose, they're forthright about their convictions. So I think this is really helpful because it sharpens us. It causes us to reflect carefully and thoughtfully on contentious issues. But then at the end of the day, we are a voluntary organization. And so these people, these fellow commissioners at GA, these men, they're here because they want to be here. And so, and there's something to celebrate that. And I have enjoyed very much going to GA and getting to know people like you. And then that's a nice thing too of the technology. But I love the PCA. I'm bullish for the PCA. People should buy PCA stock. They should not buy Bitcoin. I keep thinking about the big cryptocurrency gift and wondering whether or not the PCA Foundation. Did you hear about the PCA Foundation?
I wonder if that's worth anything. It was $200 million.
Yeah,
or something.
I hope that they liquidate, like they turned it into cash immediately.
Yes, but I think they had to hold it for 5 years or something.
Oh wow!
Yeah,
so it's worth
I think
$2.82.
I think later this month we'll have an episode with David Hall, whose book we are giving away. If you will share this episode on your social media via Twitter, you can be entered in to win a copy of David Hall's book. Celebrating the 50th years, but reflecting on the 50 years of the PCA. But one of the things he brings out is that the PCA has gone up and down. That one side has been on the ascendancy than the other, but we've been moving toward greater clarity and conviction toward confessional fidelity, I think, especially right now. Well, Dr. Bruce, thank you for being on. Any closing words?
Well, may God bless you and your family and your ministry, and may establish the work of our hands.
Amen. God bless His church. Amen. Thank you, sir.
Hi, this is Mama Beasy. Thanks for listening to my dad's podcast, which is sponsored by Jude Free. Visit the website judefreepca.org.
That's right, Thornwell. Please come back again next week when I am joined by Andy Young along with Joshua Rieger as we discuss God's faithfulness to the ordinary means of grace as He gathers people to Himself through the preaching and teaching of His Word. And remember, you can be entered to win a copy of David Hall's new book, Irony in the Presbyterian Church in America, by sharing this episode on Twitter and tagging the Westminster Standard Podcast on Twitter. Thank you very much.